Good afternoon. I'm Mimi Riley, the Dorothy Danforth Compton Professor here at the Miller Center, and one of the academic directors for the Project on Democracy and Capitalism. It's my pleasure today to welcome you as we discuss and celebrate Professor Paul Stephan's latest book, The World Crisis in International Law, The Knowledge Economy and the Battle for the Future. We welcome questions from the audience in the second half of today's program. You'll see a bar at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to enter your question there. Paul Stephan is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow and is the John C. Jeffries Jr. Distinguished Professor of Law and the David Ibekin Research Professor of Law. He's an expert on foreign relations law, international law, comparative law, international business, international civil litigation, and international dispute resolution, with an emphasis on Russian, Soviet, and post-Soviet legal systems. He also has broad policy experience, having served as counselor on international law in the U.S. Department of State and special counsel to the General Counsel in the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as an advisor to the U.S. Department of Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD on issues of global tax reform. Joining us today as discussant is Paul Mahoney, David and Mary Harrison Distinguished Professor and Dean of the University of Virginia School of Law from 2008 to 2016. Paul, another Paul, is an expert in securities regulation, law and economic development, corporate finance, financial derivatives, and contracts. His book, Wasting a Crisis: Why Securities Regulation Fails, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2015. The book we're celebrating today, The World Crisis in International Law, is one of those rare books that is both exceptionally useful for experts in the field and yet completely accessible for a broader audience. In it, Paul explores the evolution of the knowledge economy, how elites within that economy shaped international law, and the unintended consequences of those efforts to create a new world order. All of that has resulted, and we may have some debate about causation later in this discussion, with us dancing along the precipice, the title of the penultimate chapter. This is a very ambitious book. Its scope is enormous. It's also a fun and sometimes frightening read. The book reflects Paul's unique experience. He was often in the room where it happened, and the book alternates between observations from the ground and legal and economic analysis. Paul Stephan, what's the origin of this book? How did you start to think about these issues, and what did you want your readers to take from it?
So Mimi, first, thanks to the Democracy and Capitalism Project for hosting this, and to you and my dear friend and smarter younger brother, Paul Mahoney, for taking part in this. In a sense, this is a project that's been percolating since I first started teaching international business at the law school back in the late 1980s. I mean, one of the first things that struck me was to what extent the modern international economy was based on knowledge products as opposed to the old-fashioned David Ricardo wool and port that was the model for our earlier conceptions of the economy, and how much more important that became over the 30 plus years that I was teaching this stuff. It crystallized in a couple of articles I wrote right as COVID started. And I thought while everything was shut down, even though I was working at the Pentagon, a lot of that work was remote, that I might have time to tackle this project and write something that I hoped would reach a general audience, but would capture my, many decades of thinking about this problem.
So let's start with a definition for people who haven't yet read the book, and I recommend to everyone that you do read the book. What exactly is the knowledge economy, and how is it different from globalization?
Yeah, so pinning down a definition, one that can be sufficiently clear that it might be testable with quantitative methods is not something I tried to do. I tried to capture something that seemed clear enough to me as an observer, but it's not rigorous enough, at least the way I develop it. It is on the lips of many people. It's a book by a famous lefty professor called The Knowledge Economy, Roberto Unger at Harvard. But to me, it is the use of knowledge, and we should understand knowledge as what happens to information after we refine it. What happens, that knowledge as both an input in production and increasingly an output as well as a product itself. Without having a clear definition, I can't test the claim that it's growing in proportion, but it just seems evident to me. So I was comfortable going with that. And how is this different from globalization? Well, the way I put it in the book, one's an input, the other's an output. The knowledge economy is a form of production, and as we restructure how we make things, how we add value, using things in the most capacious idea possible, services, not just things we can touch. That creates incentives, and one thing that knowledge does is scale. That is to say, you actually have positive returns to scale as opposed to negative returns that you get in the physical world. And therefore, the knowledge economy creates huge incentives to increase the movement of goods, services, capital, and people across national boundaries, just to expand the market. Globalization is the response to those incentives in legal rules that lower barriers to movement of those four things. But I want to focus on what I think is driving it as opposed to what I think is a response to those economic forces. Also, globalization, I think, is just abused so much in the literature. It's become kind of mush, kind of like neoliberal, you know. It means different things to different people, and I just want to stay away from those controversies as far as I can.
The book opens in the 1990s, and I'm old enough to remember an Atlantic magazine cover that was emblazoned Pax Americana, and the world was all good. It felt like we had found solutions for all the world's problems. There was a new international order. It was better than we even dared hope. You were in the Soviet Union when it crumbled. And in fact, I think in the book you note that you were in Parliament literally on its last day. Tell us about that. What were the hopes of that time? How did it set up for some of the ways we reacted to that history?
So the hopes were far more on our side than the other side. And I think one of the things that we lost sight of in that time was that there was another side. I mean, I was in the Kremlin on the last day that the legislature existed, the Soviet legislature existed. The chairman of the legislature was a professor of constitutional law who I'd befriended years before. And his take on this is, okay, we're finishing up now, and I feel good because historically when governments fell in Russia, you were thrown over the walls of the Kremlin onto the waiting pikes. And all I'm doing is turning out the lights and walking out the door. That's good. But you can sense in that maybe a bittersweet take on the entire experience. America believed that both liberal democracy, that is to say, the conception of domestic order that we and our friends in the world had become the new model, that everyone wanted to be like us, and that the way that manifested itself internationally was the idea of liberal internationalism, with the rule of international law as one of the core concepts. But I think the two were connected, and one of the connections was an idea that became very popular in the 90s of the democratic peace. As long as the world contained only liberal democracies, they would not go to war against each other. And so there was hope for peace and prosperity at the time, leading to the erection of all these new international institutions, the old GATT General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade became the World Trade Organization. NAFTA happened, the European Economic Community became the European Union, and so on and so on throughout the decade.
So drill down a little bit further on that. Exactly how did institutions change, react to that situation? You write in the book that we actually have a top-down vision of international law at that point. How did that work exactly?
Well, part of this was the creation of new international courts. Rather than having international institutions as talking shops, and in some cases, like the old GATT, with arbitration facilities that provided advice but couldn't bind anyone, we'd have real courts. And just one example from the trade area, the old GATT arbitration system was not replaced but superseded by a new layer, something called the appellate body, which is a permanent court. And unlike the panels, they actually had in theory, under the treaties, had the power to bind the parties, so that they handed down the word. The European Court of Human Rights, the Strasbourg Court, was reformed to make it more like a real court with direct access by aggrieved citizens, which did not exist before then. At the end of the decade, the International Criminal Court was created. There had been two prior ad hoc courts created by the Security Council for Yugoslavia and Rwanda. But now we had what was supposed to be a universal human rights court, at least human rights in the context of war. And many other examples, but these are the most prominent of making law professors and lawyers more significant in the management of the international order.
It didn't work out to our benefit.
As it turned out.
So carrying on with that, it turns out our hopes were dashed. And as you say in the book, the 21st century is where all our hopes from the 90s went to die. You point out that the structural elements of that undoing were already built in. Many of our assumptions were wrong. What happened?
Well, I can first talk about the events, and then if you want, I can talk about my story that provides a thread of an explanation as why these events. But I mean, as Americans, we probably would start the turn away from our hopes with 9/11 as a huge wake-up call. A number of other challenges, but next probably the world recession, which undermined confidence in the international management of the world economy. In the United States, Paul is the expert on this. My smarter, younger friend is the expert on this. But I think it's fair to say that compared to many countries in the world, we got off relatively light in the United States, but it was still profound. And interestingly, much more profound for the more vulnerable in our economy than the well-off. People who could survive the market downturn and had their investments back up within 3 or 4 years. People who did not have savings, who depended on unguaranteed employment. People whose only savings was their house, which they might have bought and quickly acquired a mortgage underwater. These people were significantly harmed economically. So there's a real disparity in the effects of these crises. The Arab Spring, I think, was significant in part because everyone thought that things were going our way. We had the color revolutions in Europe, Georgia, which seemed to be all about bottom-up organization using social media as a way of defeating people with guns in power. And then with the Arab Spring, it just went south in a hurry, and the people with social media got crushed by the people with guns just about everywhere. And I think at this date, we can say really everywhere. Then the shock events, the evidence that something really different was going on in the world would be, for starters, particularly those of us who are Atlanticists, the twin shocks of Brexit and the Trump election, where it seemed, not only were there things for us to worry about, but that significant majorities of our electorates were buying into resistance, indeed repudiation of some of these projects. And then things have gone downhill from there. Immigration crises, more in Europe directly, although it's a simmering problem in the United States. The COVID, of course, profoundly disrupted the world, and I think had a deeply disproportionate impact on privileged versus unprivileged people. I handed in the manuscript weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine, but I anticipated that and was able to touch up the manuscript a little bit to acknowledge its existence. But we also know at this time that the question of Taiwan, the question of nuclear arms in Iran are simmering issues that we have to fear. Meanwhile, profound economic and social inequality in many parts of the world, driving politics, driving a deep insecurity about the status quo, just giving us more to worry about.
All very happy. So I'm going to pass it to Paul Mahoney, our discussant today, who is far more qualified than I am to take you to task, Paul. So let's pass it on. And Paul?
Well, thank you, Mimi, and it's just an honor to comment on a book by my dear friend and dare I say mentor. The book is so full of fascinating and important insights that it's a little bit hard for me to know where to start. And I certainly wouldn't even try to tell Paul anything about international law or international relations. So let me say a few things about the U.S. economy. During the period that is really the core of the book's narrative, beginning in roughly 1990. If you look at a roster of the largest U.S. companies in 1990, they are all manufacturing and oil and gas companies, so very much old economy companies. And today, of course, it's tech giants that are the largest companies in the United States. Over that same period, there was a rather steady growth in income inequality. And those two trends play a large role in the book. I'm going to just identify a couple of other developments in the same period that seem to me to be quite important. So for one, the annual rate of growth of real per capita GDP in the United States fell by a full percentage point over that period. That is to say, in the 30 years leading up to 1990, growth averaged about 2.5% a year in real terms. Since that point, it's been a bit under 1.5%. And that has a truly profound impact on people's lives. There's also been a rather large shift in government policy, fiscal policy in particular. If we go back to 1990, sort of pure transfer payments through entitlements, subsidies, and so on, made up something in the range of 50% of the federal budget. Today, it's well over 70%, with, of course, corresponding falls in the percentage spent on infrastructure, defense, and other public goods. And unlike the case in 1990, a fairly substantial part of those recurring expenditures are financed by borrowing rather than taxes. Now, in a zero interest rate environment, that makes it seem like many of these policies are free, which unfortunately they aren't. Now, with all these things going on, it's a little bit hard to say, okay, what's cause and what's effect? And the book, I would say, implicitly ties them together with roughly the following causal story. The rise of the knowledge economy produced greater income inequality, which produced political dysfunction, which produced deteriorating economic outcomes. I think there's an alternative possible explanation that goes something along the following lines. Bad policies produced economic stagnation, which in turn exacerbated income inequality, which then produced political conflict. And interestingly, you'll note that technology doesn't really play a role in that story. It's just sort of, as it were, along for the ride. So I guess the first thing I'd be interested in hearing from the older and wiser Paul is, does it matter which of these stories we think is right? Do you know what's your assessment of these alternative explanations?
So I think in the world that we know it, both have to have some truth to it. But that's kind of a tough narrative to frame a book that you're trying to reach a broad audience with. So I don't exclude the bad macroeconomic story as part of the entire picture. Certainly a rising tide suppresses social conflict that might otherwise exist. But someone older than you, Paul, who went through the 60s where we had really bad we had really bad macroeconomic policy and significant social and political unrest. I don't think it looked the same as we got to the 70s as what we're seeing now. But that, again, is an impression. One of the things I don't do is test my ideas quantitatively. I don't have that skill set. And so the evidence isn't there. I mean, one of the reasons why I think the transformation in the means of production, A, exists and B, is significant, without debating that acknowledging other things certainly are going on, is, first of all, it just looks like that to me, that this shift is real, that one of the things you see around the world, if you step back from only the U.S. economy, but look at others, is something like this, sort of common threads seem to be happening in a lot of places, not all of which have necessarily the bad macroeconomic policies that we sometimes embrace. Some places have worse macroeconomic policies than us, of course. Welcome to Greece. Welcome to Spain. But Israel, for example, I don't think necessarily has the same policies, and yet you see something stunningly similar in the rise of amazing tech industries, accompanied by a rise of the anti-modernity right, as we're seeing playing out right now in Israeli politics. I think at the end of the day, bad macroeconomic policy is always going to be with us. But I like the poor, as we say in the Bible, but that these changes in technology seem to me new and different, although I admit I don't produce quantitative evidence to back up that assertion.
Well, let's drill down a little bit more on the technology revolution. And what I'd like to do is take the period from 1990 to the present and divide it roughly in half. So if you look at the period from 1990 to, let's say, about 2005, I think knowledge was very much a factor of production in exactly the way you describe it in the book. That was, after all, a period of economy-wide adoption of information technology. And even the smallest companies, word processing, spreadsheets, database software, and all of those things really had the potential to make businesses much more productive. And interestingly, you can see it in the data. There was a burst of productivity growth in the United States from 1990 to about 2005. Now, starting at about 2005, though, that productivity growth just stops. And indeed, it's anemic all the way up to this day. And obviously, this is just coincidence and maybe not causation. But I'll note that at about that same time, knowledge goes from what I would call a factor of production to more a factor of consumption. Facebook debuts in 2004, the iPhone debuts in 2007. By today, The largest tech companies in the United States all operate on effectively the same business model. They harvest ever more fine-grained information about each of us and sell it to companies that want to sell us consumer goods. And maybe this is just an old curmudgeon talking, but that doesn't seem to me to be a particularly great driver of productivity. So I guess what I'm interested in asking is, do you think the knowledge economy and information technology are going to continue to be drivers of growth in the future, or have they really sort of tapped out?
Great question, Paul. Very insightful, and I have some sort of diffident responses, but they're not conclusive. I mean, one is that the narrow tech, the Silicon Valley conception of tech is only one piece of the picture. I mean, I think we're seeing extraordinary, as we saw during the COVID epidemic, extraordinary breakthroughs in biotech, which as an aging person, I can only hope will be even more spectacular in the not so distant future. I also think that some of the consumption aspects that we saw, even in the sort of cyber tech and social media and the like, have investment dimensions that our numbers don't really capture. So, I mean, I agree that the business model is partly about building up data sets to enable us to sell, so Amazon can function, so we can sell more consumer goods at a lower cost. But I'm prepared to believe that some of the value of those huge data sets that we're building up through applications like Facebook and Amazon and the like are themselves potentially resources for other technologies that will increase productivity. And so that what we might be saying, although I say this with great diffidence because it's not all clear, is a temporary period where we're cutting back consumption in order to have more investment. So I don't think we're yet stuck on what you and I both call the French model, where, basically the end game is simply making shiny new toys for people, particularly people of means, to enjoy. But we don't know, because we're definitely in a period where maybe with biotech, nanotechnology, a few other things, either we haven't yet seen the payoff, as with nanotechnology. I mean, maybe climate management technologies on the horizon, but not yet realized. And maybe biotech is an example where we're already seeing a payoff and can hope to see more. But we don't know. So that's if my story has any legs, that will be true. But until the future reveals itself, I don't know.
Yeah, I'll interject just a moment and say biotech investment is already way down in the last year and a half. So I don't think it's going to be our salvation.
Yeah, well, what's the baseline, though? Is that just against the COVID period or over the last 10 years?
Just prior to the COVID period, where there was significant investment, and now it's coming down.
But arguably, COVID was a real disruptor, and it's going to take a while for things to settle down.
Paul, anything?
Well, so we've both talked about economics. Now let's switch to politics. The book makes frequent reference to populism, which I would think of as a political movement that has non-college educated blue-collar workers sort of at its core. And one way to look at populism is that it's a reaction to the impersonal economic and technological forces that the book describes in such interesting and vivid detail. Another way of seeing it is that it's a reaction to a set of political developments over roughly the past 15 years or so that have ironically tended to cushion the college educated against these very economic forces, while leaving the non-college educated more or less to fend for themselves. So most obviously in 2008 to 2009, widespread bailouts gave the college educated a softer landing from the disruptions of the financial crisis than others. More recently, of course, the forgiveness, which may or may not stand, but the attempt to forgive government student loans could potentially be $1 trillion giveaway to the college educated. The non-college educated, meanwhile, have had a series of pretty hard landings. And I think it's also worth perhaps pointing out that not everyone who graduates from college leaves with a degree in engineering or data science or biotechnology. Unfortunately, many do not acquire much in the way of advanced analytical skills, but yet they seem to manage to land jobs in government, nonprofit, and corporate, you name it, human resources offices, government relations offices, et cetera, non-revenue generating parts of corporate America. And again, you know, one can imagine the non-college educated looking at this and saying, you know, technology isn't generating those jobs. Politics is generating those jobs, more or less. And why isn't it generating jobs for me? So I guess the question then is again, which of these is more important as a driver of populist politics, and does it matter in terms of how we move forward?
So I think one of my arguments that you would agree with is that the salient divide in much of the world is between the top 20% and everybody else. In other words, I strongly reject the 1% thesis. And when people talk about income inequality, that that tends to be the focus. The extravagant Gilded Age, gaudy baubles that the most highly rewarded people have, and I argue, and I think there's plenty of evidence to back this up, that's not really driving politics. That the people who hate the 1% are typically the 5%. You know, the Nobel-winning economist who hates the fact that investment bankers make more money than he does. We could name names, but we don't have to. And it's also true that much of what the description of populism we have, at least in our circles and our media sources, tend to be the people that populists hate describing the populists, you know, the despicables. And I try, I'm not sure I'm totally successful, but I try to get away from that concept and say the line really is much more of a class line, where people who benefit from the knowledge economy, if only in adjacent jobs that may be a bit orthogonal to real wealth creation, still are tied to the main drivers of wealth creation in a way that leave out people. And one of the arguments I stole from you, well, you gave me, so I didn't steal it, but you know, looking at the extent to which college degrees are used as a screen for just basic ability to show up for work, and therefore how many really unnecessary BA requirements we have in the workforce, as well as those bureaucrats you identify who use their licensing powers to deny life opportunities to people who have real skills. They're just not the skills we reward in higher education, and want to make something of their lives, but they can't get a license to do so because there are growing, burgeoning bureaucracies that exist to deny those people life opportunities. I think that certainly in the United States and to some extent in Europe, I mean, there's a reason everyone hates Brussels, is the real fault lines of politics, not the super wealthy versus everyone else. So to that extent, I really agree with you. Then you look at places where I think these politics are not yet realized, but are lurking, and I think smart leaders already are aware of them. And I mean China, where the lifting up of people from extreme poverty has not obliterated. They've changed the lines, but one of the things you do when you're no longer in extreme poverty is not all your energy is devoted to just survival, and you develop some energy to resent and be obstreperous and maybe even more. And so I regard the populist backlash within China as something to really worry about. Certainly, if I were President Xi, that would be my big worry right now. And I think we can see that taking place in many other countries, in India, certainly, Brazil, South Africa is redolent with this. Yeah, so I agree populism is hard, but I think if we understand the knowledge economy broadly enough to include knowledge economy adjacent people, the story still works.
Well, and I absolutely think you're right that one of the things that must be keeping authoritarian governments all over the world, or even just governments that don't have quite as much political legitimacy as they might awake at night, is just as people lift themselves out of poverty, they begin to demand things from their government, and it's hard to respond to those demands. I mean, governments that are used to just ordering people to do things and sucking up surpluses, when they're suddenly told, no, you actually have to provide some public goods, they can find that transition a very, very difficult one to make.
Yep.
So we have a growing list of questions. I welcome anyone who has a question to post it before it's too late. I'm going to pose a couple of these really to both of you at this point. And let's start with, how do we reconcile knowledge economy-based capitalist states like the Nordics and their increasing, or at least not declining, liberalization?
Well, I would say there are cracks there. I mean, that the Nordic countries are exactly where we are seeing greater far-right participation in government than, say, in Central Europe, France, or Germany. And the new election in Estonia is just the most recent, although we don't know what the new government in Estonia will look like yet. But I think this has been a 10-year trend now of fairly populist parties actually not leading governments, but getting admitted to coalitions in the Nordic when they haven't yet in other parts of Europe. So, I think I of course love my time in the Nordic world, but I think it's a very well studied phenomenon that with Europe as the principal data set, that there's a real trade-off between ethnic homogeneity and safety net. And as you adopt diversity, which as an American I think is our treasure and our source of pride, but diversity comes at least an initial cost. It is a drawdown on social capital, even if ultimately you can make the country more resilient and stronger. You still have to adapt, and the adaptation period is costly. And that's, I think, the phase that the Nordics are going through, because they were so homogenous ethnically until certainly this century, that they're paying a bit of a price. We have bumps in the road still, and we have deep challenges still, but I would take our challenges over anyone else's.
Yeah, and I completely agree with all of that. And I would just add in one small additional point, which is actually even before mass immigration into the Nordic countries, they were starting to become concerned that their social model was simply not sustainable. So, Sweden, for example, by the early 1990s, had already concluded that something had to change, and its spending on social programs actually began to decline at that point as a percent of GDP. So I think the premise of the question does run into some factual challenges.
Again, to both of you, I think. And I'm going to try and combine two of these questions together to some degree. Is there something inherently different between commodity liberalism and knowledge liberalism that makes the former viable and the latter not? And related to that is another question, which is, why is this time different? We've had technological expansion periods before. The previous one seemed to have accelerated the liberal order. This one does the opposite. Now, I think Paul Mahoney has addressed some of that in some of his comments, but I'd like you to take that question on fully.
Sure. Well, first of all, I would not argue that liberalism is unsustainable. It's only unsustainable if that's the only social objective you have. I mean, I think the challenge, to put it succinctly, is to match human capital and social capital accumulation. And the knowledge economy is very much about human capital and tends to neglect social capital, including basic social trust. And so I wouldn't give up on the knowledge economy, quite the contrary. But I think there are challenges that have to be recognized. Secondly, any economic revolution, any period of creative destruction does create social disorder as people adjust. You know, if our period is the years after World War II, fine, but really the commodity liberalization period can be seen as starting not long after the Napoleonic Wars, you know, the Corn Laws in England, 1836, I think that is. Maybe I'm off. 46. It was a response to the Irish famine, an inadequate response to the Irish famine. You know, and really only ended with World War I. You know, we've had these periods before. The first big period coincided with the growth of democracy, but nothing like the, you know, I think the egalitarianism that we had after World War II. Although I have to note, you know, that egalitarianism did not include women, did not include racial minorities, and it couldn't include unconventional gender preferences because they didn't exist in the popular imagination back then. So, you know, yeah. So I wouldn't give up on the knowledge economy. It's my answer to that. We just have to take more on board.
So, you know, the question is sort of pitched at a high level of generality, and my answer is going to be at a high level of generality. One of the things that I learned from the book was that those who think about income inequality at the level of the individual and those who think about it at the level of the country actually have quite a lot to learn from one another. Interestingly, if you ask economists, you know, why over the last 150 years have some countries grown rapidly and some and others have fallen behind, you get two classes of answers. One class of answer focuses very much on technology, and there's something that's very appealing about that, because we know that periods of technological innovation, from the moldboard plow all the way to the transistor and beyond, do produce bursts of productivity and economic growth. So it only makes sense to say, well, if we see that some countries are moving ahead and others are falling behind, it must be because there are just differences in their ability to develop and to exploit new technologies. So that's one set of answers. But there's another set of answers that says it's actually about policies and the institutions that make those policies either effective or ineffective. So, you know, putting it in a very oversimplified way, you know, governments do things that are what we might call a helping hand. They produce a lot of public goods, from infrastructure to education, et cetera. And they do things that we might think of as the grasping hand, which is they simply take from particular interest group coalitions and give to others. And roughly speaking, you know, the more of the former and the less of the latter you do, the more economic growth you get. And again, if you believe in that latter story, technology doesn't actually play a huge role. I mean, obviously, you don't get growth without technology, but technology is something that is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for economic prosperity.
And the only thing I would add to that, Paul, totally agreeing with everything you said, but I think low social capital is one of the foundations for grasping hand governments. And as you and I both know from our days in Russia and its environs, it's very hard to preach good policy when the audience is a very low social capital audience that just can't believe that anything other than steal first before anyone else isn't the right social response.
Right, absolutely.
So one more before we start pulling it together with the end of the book. What institutional changes, global or domestic, would you recommend to expand the benefits of the knowledge economy to a bigger demographic? Is it just education or human capital accumulation? What cultural factors make people don't want to transition to the knowledge economy? Sorry, garbled the last bit of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things about human capital accumulation that I think you can infer from the U.S. experience, I think our country is the best in the world at educating the top 20 to 10%. So high-end human capital accumulation, I think we really do an amazing job, particularly given how diverse people who are getting the benefits are. Not that we couldn't do better, but I think there's a lot of evidence, I'm persuaded, that the traditional models of human capital accumulation really aren't helpful to a large portion of people who don't acquire those kind of skills. Putting to aside what those kind of skills are. So I think putting more resources in education, there's a case to be made, will increase social divisions and therefore lower human capital. At least it's something to be worried about. So I think we need to rethink how it is that we can be an integrated society in every sense of that word, to build social, political, and cultural respect for people, to maintain certain fundamental principles like there is honor in work, and to respect, all people at work, not just people who work the way the three of us do. If I knew exactly how to do this, I'd be out there doing it. So I think that is what we ought to be investing in, and just trying to figure out how we can do things that build social solidarity, build social respect. And I don't think handing money out is necessarily the way to do that.
I would just make I agree with that, but I would add to it the following observation. Paul talks obviously a lot, because it's a central feature of the story about what one might call elite education, the sort of college education for the top, pick your number, 20%. There was an era when public K through 12 education was an extraordinary engine of social mobility and human capital formation in the United States. Before public K through 12 education became largely captured by the people who provide it. And its focus now, to be blunt, is much more on providing jobs for college-educated people than preparing the students to potentially go to college or otherwise develop human capital. And that just, to be honest, strikes me as scandalous and something that as a wealthy country we really shouldn't put up with.
Yeah, just to underline Paul's point, I think the number one problem we face in America, bigger than anything else, is our public education system. And I also think that the more conventional and popular responses are not good responses to that challenge. It is the challenge, and I don't think we've really figured out, at least on a broad, popular, politically supported basis, what the right response is. But we got to find a response.
So let's start pulling things together, and let's start with doom and gloom to start, then we'll move into solutions. Paul, the penultimate chapter, as I mentioned earlier, of the book is entitled Dancing Along the Precipice. The subheadings are pretty bleak: war, plague, famine, and I could go on. We've already discussed some of the intractable problems facing us, but as you look at this, education being one that we have to address, what are other problems that you think if we don't address, we're falling off that precipice?
Well, some of the things I talk as potential disasters, I mean, other than the obvious ones, you know, the nuclear threat that we've lived under since 1948. I think that's when the Russians first exploded a nuclear weapon, when it went from a single country to multiple. I mean, no, so there are big things like that in which a lot of people have devoted a lot of time and energy. I don't have much to add to that other than to say, you know, it's there. But I do spend time talking about climate change as a challenge. I think it's a manageable one. I'm not in the despair, give up, we're doomed department. But I think if we do nothing, there will be very significant changes with differential effects around the world. And the one thing we know is that we'll create new sets of winners and losers, and they won't be happy. And you know, violence in many forms is likely to result. You know, I think all our false hopes about the web as a place of self-realization and democracy, I think have been negated, and it's become a pretty polluted place. And I think we need to think about appropriate responses to those problems within a context of a, you know, our pacing adversary, China, that sees opportunities where we might see problems. And our friends in Europe seem to have just ignored China as a problem, which I think is a real threat to the Europeans going forward. You know, migration, you know, we have to somehow figure out how to take advantage of this great diversity of experiences and talents on this planet and find ways of allowing people to realize their best lives, which often involves moving somewhere else, but doing it in a way that is not destructive, unnecessarily destructive to incumbents, to make sure that incumbents feel that they are respected and included and benefited in some way, which certainly in the rich world we're not doing right now. So even when we get payoffs from immigration, they tend to be realized at the upper income and cultural scale sectors rather than all the way through the society, I think. You know, these are just a few examples.
So as we pull this to a close, let's end a little optimistically. Among your solutions in the last chapter is taking, instead of a top-down approach on international law, a bottoms-up approach. What are your solutions? How would that work? And I'm going to ask you to answer that, but Paul, feel free to respond, although we have to wrap up soon.
So part of my response is quite honestly contrarian, because as you both know of me, I'm a pretty contrarian guy. So one thing that irritates me among my friends, particularly in the international law community, is the sense that we just have to try harder than admitting that some of the institutions just aren't fit for purpose in the world we live in now. So what's different from building more international institutions that will employ more highly educated people, but probably won't create much positive effects on people's lives? Well, I think there are a number of things that can be done that will be organized principally at the state level, or maybe even sub-state level, and that the task of international relations and international law ought to be to allow those experiments to go forward so that we can learn from them. So that, if they don't turn out not to work out, we can drop them. But if we can learn from them, that we can build on what we learn. And just one example, this is now how we're approaching climate change at the international law level, that our current structure ever since 2015 has been no attempt to coordinate commitments, quantitative commitments, how much carbon we're going to cut back on, but a lot of legally binding commitments to transparency. We will announce our commitments such as they are and provide a lot of information about compliance without being bound to any particular commitment. And I think that's a very interesting model, and I think it's more promising than simply extending the power of the UN Committee on Climate Change and having them dictate to us what we can and cannot do. That cannot possibly work.
Paul Mahoney, response and last thoughts?
Well, I find myself very much in agreement. I would just make one final observation that goes back to the beginning of Paul's narrative in 1990. Someone who was born in the United States in that year or afterwards has spent his or her entire adult life in the world that the financial crisis and the pandemic have made, which is one in which freedom is in retreat across a broad front. They've been raised to believe that it is both possible and desirable to trade freedom for safety. And I think the evidence that trade is in fact possible, even if it were desirable, is pretty lacking. So I think a renewed understanding of the role that freedom has played in building the strength and prosperity that we take for granted in the United States is the place I would start.
Last thoughts, Paul.
Well, I of course endorse everything Paul says, but I think it's freedom works only in the context of some minimal level of social order and what we call social capital, and so I think freedom is certainly a end result and something that can only be learned by doing, and also involving risk taking and not being protected from your mistakes. But that has to be accompanied by things that connect us to each other, so that we don't feel that my freedom only can be exercised at somebody else's expense. I think it's a doable project, but that's where we have to go.
I want to thank both of you. It's a tremendously interesting and informative book. I learned a lot from it, and I've learned a lot from this conversation today. And I want to thank the audience for being here today. I recommend getting this book. It has opened windows I didn't know existed. So thank you to everyone, and we are adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you.